From CGTN headquarters in Beijing, this is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello and welcome to The Hub. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. As France gets ready for the presidential elections on Sunday, there are already two frontrunners. Will President Emmanuel Macron remain in the Élysée Palace for a second term? Or will France get its first woman president in Marine Le Pen? Is the Ukraine situation a decisive factor for voters? And how will the election results impact Europe and NATO? Joining us in the conversation is Ruet from Paris, at the heart of the action. He's also the chairman of the think tank Bridge Tank from Berlin, Germany. We have Dr. Thorsten. Good evening, good morning. Thorsten Jelinek, senior fellow and European director at the Taihe Institute, a think tank based in Beijing, China. And also we have with us in eastern China's Zhejiang province, Song Xin, former policy advisor at the European Parliament. Currently, she's the global affairs consultant at Zhou Masters, a management consultancy. Before I go to our experts, I want to brief our audience about the candidates themselves. There are so far 12 candidates in this French presidential elections, 8 men, 4 women. It is a wide spectrum, to say the least, including the sitting president, of course, the mayor of Paris, an ex-teacher, a former shepherd turned MP. If there's no clear winner on Sunday, a runoff election will be held between the top 2 winners on April the 24th. 5 years ago, we all remember Macron defeated far-right leader Marine Le Pen by a very narrow margin. So, Joe, let me go to you first. This time around, do you see history repeating itself? Could that be a runoff between Le Pen and Macron?
Well, it could, and it might not at the same time. You know, polls are only polls. Especially, we have a rule to stop polling a few days before the election. So you mentioned Marine Le Pen, who's, according to many polls, is coming second after the voting intention for President Macron. But don't forget there's Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Jean-Luc Mélenchon is a seasoned politician from the left wing. He's in a narrow distance from Marine Le Pen. 5 years ago, he missed being on the second round of the election by just a few thousands of votes. So we stand within the margin of error of what are the polls. You know, so this scenario is still to be considered. Now, what is important is that you're right. We're making history in a sense where we see that the classical left-wing parties and the classical right-wing parties seem to have nearly disappeared from the intentions of votes.
Okay, Thorsten, how do you look at the state of the campaign? What's your rating on it?
Well, you know, we've been in
Thorsten, actually, if I can go to you first, and Joe, hang there.
Thank you. Now I can just echo the words that we have actually only one dark horse coming up here, which is the veteran leftist Mélenchon, and he came basically out of the ashes, if you wish, as the third time they're meeting in the campaign with against Marine Le Pen, and I think it seems he's a little bit more moderate in terms. So he has classical, social democratic, socialist values he's campaigning for, more equality. He has also climate to attract the younger people. He even attracted MEDEF, the leading industrial association in France. So that's the one who is, I think, who has some probability. But I also think that it's less likely that he will make to the second round.
Okay, Madam Song Xin, what do you think? Will there be any black horses?
Well, to be honest, I think, the second round will be really tricky because in 2015, when we had this Brexit referendum, and we also thought that there might be a slight winning from this stay camp. But in the end, it was exactly the opposite scenario, because a lot of people think, since most of the people will vote to stay, then my vote probably will not count, and I want to use my vote to punish actually the European institution. And in the end, the more people think about this, and the more it will actually reverse the final result. So the second round this year can be really, really, really tricky.
But what indications or indicators did you pick up? Which side could, the results swing? To Le Pen or to Macron, maybe?
Oh, I mean actually Le Pen, because a lot of people think that the others will pick up actually the instructions of their previous actually candidate, and they will vote for Macron, and then they will think probably I can use my vote for to vote for Le Pen, but this kind of thinking might affect actually the final result.
Yeah, complacency can be bad sometimes. Zhou, what do you think? I mean, the 2022 presidential election seems to be a contest between centrists, represented by Macron, of course, and also by the far right and far left leaders. How do they become a tussle, if you will, between institutionalists and populists in France?
Well, first of all, what is very important and which is pretty new in the Fifth Republic, which was started in 1958 in France, is that for the first time you have an incumbent president which stands at a 26% intention vote. Usually, a president who's had a first mandate is eroded. So somehow, the President Macron has consolidated his position. He has, for the first time, created a center. So don't take this center for granted. So as this is new in French history over the last 5 years, there are testings on the left and on the right. And as was said, the right is rather far right, but has been made smoother by Marine Le Pen. It's not exactly the same Marine Le Pen today as 5 years ago. And the so-called extreme left is not extreme left. It's the good old social democrat agenda with a bit more emphasis on environment, labor. So I think the political situation is very peculiar. Now, one very important thing is that the system has changed as well. We used to say, there was the saying that in the first round, we eliminate, we move from 12 odd candidates to 10. And in the second round, we choose. This time is the reverse. This time, tomorrow, people will choose whom they want to see in the second round, but then they will either fear Marine Le Pen or fear Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and they will try to eliminate them. I don't think that the people who want to eliminate Emmanuel Macron will be so numerous. So I think Emmanuel Macron really stands a good chance. The margin will be narrow, but he should be the next president.
Thorsten, do you look at that way too? I mean, voter split is very important for countries who have multiple rounds of elections. Which candidate could the voters who went for other candidates vote for the second round?
Well, I agree that that often you take the vote to punish, the incumbent in this way. So I fully agree. I think here when you maybe contrast Le Pen and Mélenchon, you see that there is a slight difference also. I mean, Mélenchon is still more ideological, even though he doesn't do a kind of a classical class-based campaign, and he's more moderate. But Le Pen here is, she is probably least ideological in a way. I mean, she is a populist, is on the right side, this is obvious. But you can see it maybe in relation to the Ukraine war, that actually it just says it's not our war, whereas on the left side there is some, still some not support, but I would say the critique towards the US, towards NATO, the expansion. So there are kind of ideological elements in a classical sense. So it's a question how this weighs in, how important it will be for the voters. I think that remains an unknown for now.
Let's talk about the issues. You mentioned Ukraine. Song Xin, how do you look at the issue of Ukraine, and how do you think that has impacted the state of the campaign in France?
Actually, the Ukraine crisis reshaped the French presidential campaign during... Sorry.
Song Xin, go ahead, please.
during two phases. In the first phase, actually, it enabled President Macron to get more popularities because due to this brutal challenge from Russia, and the French society was more united behind the current government and to cope with all the challenges. But during the second phase, because of the energy crisis and the skyrocketing inflation, a lot of fears and a lot of concerns start to increase. And that helped Marine Le Pen and Jean-Luc Mélenchon to get back more of their potential votes. Because during the first phase, due to their previous remarks about Russia and their links with Russian President Putin, and they were kind of criticized for their naive foreign policy proposal. But right now, due to this inflation problem, and they are gaining back popularities in France. That's why we are seeing a very different, they are closing in on Macron, like in the latest polls.
Yeah, it is a multifaceted issue. Zhou, how do you think President Macron has fared so far? How is he really regarded by the French electorate?
On
Ukraine, of course.
You mean, yeah. I would like to link this Ukraine crisis to your question on populism versus institutionalists. Marine Le Pen, she's a populist. She's populist on any topic, including Ukraine, and she's been switching positions. So she has lost credibility. I think she can't gather the additional votes to become the next president. The way 5 years ago she had lost credibility on economic matters, this time she has lost enough credibility on diplomatic and security matters to become the next president. Jean-Luc Mélenchon is kind of an institutionalist as well. He wants the Sixth Republic, and he's very carefully analyzing this situation on Ukraine. Now, back to the Ukraine scenario itself. There have been three phases, I think. The first phase where despite there was a brutal war launched by Russia, let's face words, negotiations, diplomacy was attempted. At the European level, pan-European level, and everyone saw that Emmanuel Macron was aligned with the EU leaders and that he acted not just as a French president, but as an acting president of the European Union, which France is chairing for 6 months. The second phase, I agree with what we've seen. We realize that it's not only a war, an illegal war, but it's brutal. There might even be war crimes that will be qualified in the future. So in this situation, everyone understands that diplomacy has to be based on strength positions. And I think that on that we'll have a third phase, which will become important in between the two rounds of the election. Here the timing is very important, where this understanding that we have to balance some disagreements on energy and economy on the one hand, and humanity concerns, humankind concerns, given the brutality of the action and the kind of butchery that happened. So I think that this will play in favor of Emmanuel Macron for sure, possibly Jean-Luc Mélenchon if he's in the second round, but not Marine Le Pen at all.
Alrighty, thanks for that analysis. Thorsten, how will the Ukraine crisis affect this very crowded field? For example, Le Pen reportedly had a Russian link in the last election cycle. A Russian bank allegedly gave a loan to her party, but she's still a strong favorite.
I think for some, they say, it's just when we look at the election itself and what the elections are for, there might be disappointment because it's overshadowed by this horrible war. Here with the far right, I think there is kind of an anti-establishment support linked towards or with Russia, and it has financial support, as you pointed out. But I think there is no ideological link in that. It's just, to get some support for that right-wing populist agenda. Whereas on the left, there is an ideological link in the past, of course, with the old communist system, socialist system of the Soviet Union, etc. But latest with that invasion, that ideological link is broken, and it must be broken for the political left, and not just in France, but throughout Europe and in the West in general. So that's more difficult actually for the left to re-establish a ideological program that has nothing to do with Russia. And you see with Jean-Luc that he basically opposes that, of course, but still he also legitimately argues against the NATO eastward expansion. So even after the war has started, so for this he has been criticized. So I think for the left it's much more difficult. As for Marine Le Pen, as I said initially, that for her it was quite easy. She said, "Well, that's not our war." So she makes it a very easy way out of it, of course. In populism, and that's what I also would like to emphasize. The populism seemed to fade away with the election of Biden. It was not in the discourse, and now we have it actually back again. But of course, it's in a way overshadowed by the Ukraine war. But it is populism which is a big threat towards Western democracy, towards the democracy in France, and this is pretty much associated with Marine Le Pen. And the populists, what does the populist do? We know the problem, like losing a key in the dark alley on a street, but the populist is searching for the key under the street light, and that's what she's doing. And that could play in her cards, whereas Macron, he wants more sanctions. He says an electoral shock for the NATO. So that can be tricky in terms of inflation, energy costs, etc. So I think this is the tension we're looking at.
Fair enough. Song Xin, what do you regard as the decisive election issues this year? Last time we know that terrorism was a key factor.
Well, apparently it is about national security or inflation this year. But deeply, I think it is nothing but about the deep feeling of insecurity in France. Because actually, despite the fact that France has a high standard of living and a permanent seat at the UN Security Council, and the country still remains the #1 tourist destination in the world, the French people perceive their society as a declining power for years. So if now national security, immigration, terrorism, or inflation emerged as some major concern, it is mainly because the French people are convinced that France is in a continuous decline and hasn't been benefiting from the globalization. And the people feel that their country used to be a big power, but right now is relatively a small one. So therefore, they think France is incapable of coping with all these challenges from the outside. There is a real social pessimism in France, let's say. Like French people got used to being in a society with very tremendous protections afforded by a very strong centralized state. But since the 1990s and the globalization successive crisis, they have had a feeling that their social and cultural protections are kind of disintegrating, and it scares the French people more than it does to people from other economically liberal countries. So all the issues such as all the decisive factors that you mentioned actually are just to reflect this deep concern in France.
Right. All right. Thanks for this update. Zhou, I want to ask you about the far right. How will a far right victory affect Europe? I mean, this can be futuristic, but really, how big of a surge do you think the elections can give to the far right? Because we know that 4 or 5 years ago in America and across some European societies, the far right was considered the silent majority.
One has to be extremely careful on those matters, on who is far right and how you count. You should not count the second round, because the second round, whoever is on the second round, there's a sense of adjustment, when people vote for all sorts of reasons, not necessarily because they're far right, but because they want to protest or whatever. So what matters is A, the first round of the election, and B, the elections that we'll have in a month from now at the Assembly, at the Parliament, okay? So if we gather, say, Mrs. Marine Le Pen and Mr. Zemmour, who's a far rightist, Zemmour doesn't have a party. So this kind of far right cannot translate into the parliament and cannot translate into a strength, into a political strength. So when it's not a political strength, it's something else. It's a feeling, it's partly a media process which gave ground to someone like Zemmour. So I would be very careful of putting a level at 30 or 33%. I think we are rather close back to the good old 20% of far right, where a sizable part of it goes to Zemmour, the other chunk goes to Marine Le Pen, and what adds up to the intentions of vote for Marine Le Pen is not people who are far right. There are other people who want to protest, who want to be in the opposition, and as the classical right-wing parties have disappeared nearly, they don't see an opportunity to be in the opposition than being in support of Marine Le Pen. And this is why Marine Le Pen, even though she's far right, has played a rather only populist, if you see what I mean, card, trying to project that she's not far right. But if she would show her own a real far right position, she wouldn't have this level. So my take is that in terms of structural political forces, the far right has not progressed in 5 years, and we're still at 20% roughly.
Yeah, well, we need to look at institutions, not just the individuals in a country's presidential or parliamentary elections. Thorsten, do you have anything to add?
Well, I would say I look more historically now, and I think if you compare France with Germany and maybe even the UK, you see this is what Germany has done in terms of structural reform, and we know this has not been pushed through in France, and I think that this is still lingering, and you could see it erupted in the Yellow Vest demonstrations and rage. And these, the Yellow Vest campaigners behind that, there is kind of a little bit of marginal support for the political left in this campaign, because they see that there is a little bit of a moderate approach here, which would kind of compromise those values, those still anti-establishment, pro-labor, etc. Values that has been pushed through. So could just add that there's still some form of reform, some bringing it from the 20th century into the 21st century. I think this is still ahead of France, and it's questionable whether this election, whoever wins it, is able to tackle that issue.
Song Xin, what do you think?
Well, to be honest, I think it would be a disaster actually for both France and for the European Union if Marine Le Pen finally wins and becomes therefore the first French female president. It would cause damage not only to the political but also the economical structure of the EU. Because it is not the lack of a continuity, because Marine Le Pen just represents a very, very different proposition on all these issues. I'm not saying she's going to jeopardize every EU project, but she's going to make it very, very difficult when it comes to coordination at the EU level. She's not a person who is willing to make any compromise when it comes to very core issues for France, such as a unified army for the EU or for the EU budget, things like this. So I think it's going to be tough if she finally wins.
There are so many other issues at stake. Let's talk about climate change. Zhou, though the French are concerned about climate change, they made no secret about it. Former Greenpeace campaigner Yannick Jadot doesn't seem to be doing well. This candidate from the Europe ecology, the Greens, has about 5-6% of support in the polls. Is climate not a strong factor as previously thought?
No, it is a strong factor. The paradox is that for many elections, there's a paradox for the Green Party because their ecological agenda has been gradually absorbed by other parties. One can, discuss with more or less emphasis, but most of the serious candidates integrate that. Jean-Luc Mélenchon integrates that. Emmanuel Macron integrates it. He can be criticized for not having been fast enough or whatever. People will always criticize. But the green agenda, so to speak, the ecological dimension, is integrated by other candidates. The Green have lost the monopoly. Now, the Green have made the strategic choice to have what they call political ecology, where they want to be aggressive in the English sense of the term, like proactive, in having social reforms where they accompany some sorts of measures which are, I would say, not just pro-people, but which are radical in terms of how the society is organized, in terms of labor, in terms of finance, and etc. And according to me, they've gone a step too far, especially as they haven't been able to do pedagogy with the people. And Jadot is exemplary of that. Jadot is someone who is disconnected to the people. He's not a kind of guy who can transmit the messages. We have strong ecologists. Pascal Canfin is the head of the ecologists at the European Parliament, someone who's softer, who's more pedagogical. So the Green have had a strategic position which they can't stick to. But the climate change is very much a concern for the French electorate. And again, the robust electorate, what I call the robust electorates, which are not, fling sweeps, again, for Macron and Mélenchon, they've integrated this in their choices for those two candidates.
There's one more angle I would like to explore, that is China. China is the 7th largest buyer of French goods and the 2nd largest seller to France. The two-way investment and trade have been booming. And it's very interesting to note that France did not join other Western countries in boycotting the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics. President Emmanuel Macron said this, actually. He said, "I want to believe that China will be consistent with its vision of territorial sovereignty and continue to seek to stop the war," referring to China's position on the Ukraine crisis. Thorsten, how do you see the presidential election affecting France-China relations?
Well, I love this quote. I want to believe that China is consistent with its vision of territorial sovereignty and continue to seek to stop this war. If President Emmanuel Macron says that he wants to believe that, it also means that he doesn't fully believe that, and he's, I think, expecting some signals from China. And I think it's courageous at this point in time that at the time of election, he still keeps an open door policy to China, and it shows that the West is not so much of a unified front for something or against something. France wants to have its own singular position vis-à-vis China, and I think it's a good development, and it's an extended hand to Chinese leaders to keep the discussion going on this war in Ukraine.
We have about 30 seconds left. Thorsten, what do you think?
I think it's a little bit speculative, so maybe it's not so important for the French to have a very strong anti-China sentiment as in other European countries or in the EU level. Second is, he invented the strategic autonomy, or he made it popularized it. So it could be that you have a little bit of slight nuance towards like the United States, NATO, and the EU having a little bit of a different angle in this conversation about China. And maybe third is maybe it's just realistic, right? So and he knows that actually China has no interest in that war and has interest that this war ends because it's doing good for no one. It's not doing good. Also, it's a big humanitarian crisis, and it interrupts the trade. We have inflation issues, etc. So
alrighty, guys, we'll have to stop it there. Thorsten, thank you very much. Songxin and Zhou, thank you for joining us and being part of this discussion. And thank you for watching The Hub on CGTN. I'm Wang Guan. Our news coverage continues. Bye and take care.